former British Prime Minister Gordon Brown, thank you so much for joining me.
Pleasure.
As UN Special Envoy for Global Education, what worries you the most about the impact of the pandemic on global education?
We talk about a medical crisis and we talk about an economic crisis, but I don't think we've talked about what is quite fundamental and is bad, and that's an education crisis. Because millions of children have not been going to school. Millions of children have not been able to benefit from the internet and that sort of learning because they don't have access to computers and to the telecommunications that are necessary. And already education was so far behind. We are supposed to be in a world where every child is going to be able to go to school and get a decent education by 2030. We have 268 million children officially out of school and have been even before the pandemic. That figure is probably nearer 300 million. And half of the children of the world are not getting the education that allows them to have basic literacy and numeracy at the age of 10. So it's an education crisis which will become something that will affect our economies and our ability to have a workforce that is productive, and therefore it will affect the standard of living of everybody in the world if we do nothing about it.
With the world's other problems going on geopolitically as well, economically, do you feel that education will be given the priority it needs?
No, it's not being given the priority. And I think everybody who looks at what's been happening over the last 2 years understands this. Aid to education has been cut by something in the order of 2 billion. So that is about a 10% cut in aid. Most governments have had to spend on health and they've had to spend on social protection, and that's essential, but it has often been at the cost of education. So we've got a double crisis in the financing of education. International aid has gone down, but the domestic mobilization of resources in education has been far more limited than it should be. And we should be talking about Build Back Better. We should be talking about how we can catch up, and we should be investing more in children now going back to school so that they can make up the lost ground. But actually, we're facing cuts in education, both internationally and nationally. And that's what we're trying to reverse. And that's, of course, why the World Bank and others are talking about this. And that's why Antonio Guterres has called a special summit on education for September this year. And in the build up to that summit, it's necessary to focus on not just what we can do about existing aid and make it better, but on innovative ways of financing education. Because while health has got new ways of financing it, like Gavi, the vaccination facility, which has a private sector arm that gets it money, and climate change has got new ways of financing it, education needs new innovative ways of getting money into the poorest countries and the countries where you have the most out of school pupils, which are often middle income countries, and where you have the most refugees who are not getting education in some cases at all, even though we have good organizations like Education Cannot Wait and UNICEF.
Which regions do you think are being most affected at this time?
Well, Africa, sadly, is probably, and it's a tragedy to have to say this, it's probably in levels of education standards and achievement about 100 years behind the most successful educational systems in the world. And that's because large numbers of children are not at primary school. But once you finish primary school, the chances of going on to secondary school are very limited. And there is so little higher education and further education offered. So it's often the case that some countries cannot even provide the graduates for teaching and for medicine that are needed, far less the graduates for the professional work that's needed to be done to build a stronger economy. And so we are spending so little on aid for Africa, despite the figures that are given by countries about what they're trying to do. We're giving, only a few pence per child per year, hardly enough to pay for a textbook in the aid we give. And the countries themselves are now faced with huge debt problems and are unable to mobilize resources for the future unless we do something about it. So obviously, there are issues in Pakistan where education is also very limited, particularly for girls. Afghanistan, we can talk about, because that is a particular crisis where girls are being deliberately excluded from school. And there are many countries in Asia, Haiti in Latin America, but of course the biggest challenge is in Africa, which is still behind because not enough investment has gone into education. And yet the future for Africa must be in having educated workers, young people who are trained for the jobs that are available for the future.
You talked about Afghanistan there, and there is a crisis happening at the moment. Women and girls are suffering within the conflict, but in fact, there are thousands of families that are on the verge of starvation. What do you want to see being done?
Well, immediately, the $4.5 billion that's been asked for by the humanitarian organization of the United Nations has got to be found. You know, there were 40 countries part of the coalition in Afghanistan, and therefore $1 trillion was spent by America on this war. So to ask for $4 billion simply to pay for food, to pay for healthcare, to pay the salaries of teachers is a very small request. But we've got to bring the world together to do it. So I'm asking Britain and Europe, and there are many other people involved in this, to call a humanitarian pledging conference so that we can raise this $4.5 billion. The Middle East will help. Many of the Islamic states will help. America must do more, and so too must Europe. And at least we can start to avoid what is really happening before our eyes, and that is emaciated families and children dying, and simply not enough food. And people queuing up for the limited amount of bread that is available, and not even being able to get that because there's been a drought and because the harvests have been very poor. So aid must move into Afghanistan on humanitarian grounds. Whatever the politics, you cannot allow sanctions to override the need to prevent starvation.
Is it fair to hold the US responsible for what's happening there now?
I don't think that's the issue, you know, because the Taliban are responsible for denying girls the right to education. The Taliban have taken control of the country and refused to form a broad-based coalition which could have relieved them from the sanctions. But we are going to be judged by the Afghan people on whether, when it comes to humanitarian support, we said for 20 years we were there to help the population of Afghanistan. We must continue to do so. And we can bypass the regime in doing so. We can get the food to people through NGOs and through UN organizations. We don't have to legitimize the regime through giving it recognition simply to get food to people. And it's not in their interest to deny us the right to do so through NGOs. At some point, we're going to have to look at how the banking system works, because if there's no money circulating in the country that's of any value, then people are not able to buy what limited food's available, and you can't buy foreign imports of food because you don't have the cash to do so. But the immediate future depends actually on us being able to offer aid and to set down conditions that if we're going to help girls' education and provide the funds, then the Taliban must agree, even if it's informally at a local level, that secondary school girls who are being denied the chance of education, now being told, by the way, they can go back to school in March as a result of the latest decree, but we must give them the chance to do so through us providing finance, and I think that's right. But the Taliban must agree that they will not suppress or intimidate or use violence against girls who want simply to have an education.
And how do you bridge the divide between lower and high income countries in terms of education? What needs to be done?
Well, education is the vehicle by which a low-income country can become a middle-income country and then become a high-income country. And, you know, if you look at China, China has managed to educate 95% of its primary and secondary pupils and relieved the population of poverty. And it's moved from low-income country to middle-income country. And most countries who are going to be successful in the future are not going to be successful because they're low-cost manufacturing producers, which is really how, you know, from Britain in the Industrial Revolution to America to Europe and then to Japan and then to Korea and then to Taiwan, export-led growth that was manufacturing driven, that was basically low-paid labor in its origins. In future, the countries that are going to be successful are going to be the ones that have high-skilled workers and can attract industries, and some of the new services can be built in one country and transmitted to another country through having an educated workforce. So I think we've got to show that education is the key to the success of low-income countries and middle-income countries as they try to become high-income countries. And so the export-led model of growth that depended on unskilled labor is really not the model, I think, of future growth for lower and middle income countries. It's an educated workforce, and that depends on having good schools and good colleges.
And what more would you like to see governments do to help this, to help bridge this divide?
Well, I think the key thing is that the international cooperation that was really made possible, the Sustainable Development Goals in 2015, the Millennium Development Goals around the turn of the century, the commitment then to universal education for all, that it was all our responsibilities to make sure that no child went without education, that we could be the first generation in history where every child went to school, that instead of developing some of the potential of some of the children in some countries, we develop all of the potential of all children. Now, that was the aim set by the international community, but clearly it hasn't been implemented. And so we go to 2030, which is the target date, the deadline for getting all children to school, and we find that we are far away from that, particularly in secondary education. And so half the children of the world will leave school without qualifications if we do nothing about it over the next few years. And that means they cannot be as productive members of the workforce and earn good salaries as they would otherwise do. So we must, as an international community, honor our promise to get more resources into education. I've proposed what's called the International Finance Facility for Education, which is a new way of using guarantees that the rich countries can give to allow the World Bank and other regional development banks to invest more resources in education. And so for guarantees of about 2 billion and some grants of about 1 billion, we could create 8 or 9 billion of extra resources for education. And that would be 50% of the aid we have at the moment. So it'd be a huge increase in the amount of aid for education. And we've got to do something like that if we're to meet the Sustainable Development Goals.
Talking about governments, as a former Prime Minister of Great Britain, I have to ask you, what do you think Boris Johnson, the current Prime Minister of Great Britain, should do? How do you feel his handling of the partygate issues is, and what would you do if you were in his position?
Well, Keir Starmer, the Labour Party leader, the leader of the opposition, has called for him to resign. And I think there is a lot of pressure within his own party for him to go. You see, the problem we've got in Britain is, as long as the focus is on scandal, on conflicts of interest, on misbehavior, on not abiding by the rules that were set for other people, then the big challenges that we face, getting our education system sorted out. I mean, there's millions of people waiting for health service appointments because COVID has dominated the practice of medicine, and we need people to be treated for cancer and everything else. And our economy needs to be on a better path and deal with climate change and all these other issues. As long as all these, if you like, scandals dominate people's waking hours, we're not dealing with the fundamental questions that we face for the future. And that includes our international responsibilities to Afghanistan. It includes getting vaccines around the world, because it is a scandal that still only 7% of Africa is vaccinated. And so I would like to see a government that focused on the big issues, and particularly the big issues of the future.
But is his position tenable? Should he resign? Do you think he should resign?
Well, that's what, I don't know all the details, and a report is going to come out in the next few days. But it does seem that when they were asking other people to obey the rules, they were not obeying the rules. And that's why, as I say, the leaders of all the other major political parties in Britain, other than his own party, are calling for him to go. And it seems that many in his own party are calling for him to go. I think this decision will be made after we see the report that's been done into what was actually happening in government. But my own view is that whatever happens in the next few weeks, there is a series of scandals, conflicts of interest, appointments that were not well done, decisions that were not well made. And I think this is catching up with this government.
Of course, you're talking about the report of Sue Gray. It is an internal investigation. Is that good enough? Will the public trust that?
Well, I think this is a fact-finding investigation. So I think what she will do is produce the facts about what actually happened. And the real issue is not whether something happened on a particular day. The real issue is, did the government that were instructing other people not to meet their relatives, not to go out to social events, not to see people on their deathbeds in hospital, not to see the loved ones who were elderly. Did the government that was making the rules also in number 10 Downing Street be breaking the rules? And that is a very serious allegation, because it destroys trust in government. It destroys, if you like, a sense that your leaders are upholding the best of standards in public life. If what you're asking other people to do, you're not doing yourself. So that's the serious issue. It's about ethics, it's about standards, it's about the conduct of public life. And that's why I think getting the facts from a very senior civil servant who's well respected, I think, across the political spectrum is the first stage of doing so.
Have you been shocked by the revelations so far, though? And where does it put Britain on the world stage?
Well, I think people, I'm afraid, are looking at Britain through the lens of these scandals. And, you know, I obviously wanted Britain to stay in the European Union, but outside the European Union, we've been trying to formulate this idea that there can be a global Britain, a Britain that can be a problem solver, can be at the center of making decisions that will help the rest of the world. And the problem is, when you're engulfed in scandal, as the government is, it is making very little contribution to the resolution of the crisis in Ukraine, to this issue of vaccinating the world, which is still a huge issue because so many remain unvaccinated, and so many of the vaccines are concentrated and monopolized by the richest countries, and of course the Afghanistan crisis, and of course climate change, where these are long-term decisions that have got to be made. And if you're focusing only on the short-term survival of a few ministers, then you're not actually dealing with the big problems that the public want you to address.
Of course, you also served as the longest-serving Chancellor of the Exchequer in modern history. Inflation has just risen to a 30-year high. What would you do to address it?
Well, clearly, you've got to look at the forces that are forcing inflation up. Some of them are structural. In other words, you've got to deal with long-term issues about technology and the cost of technology, about trade and protectionism, and some of the supply chains that are not working. And some of them are short-term, and some of these include energy costs, and therefore you've got to do something to keep the bills down. I mean, the most important consequence of inflation at the moment is the effect on poor families. And I think this is true in every country, because food bills have gone up and fuel bills have gone up, and therefore people's standards of living are falling. And even if you have a wage rise in April, and the minimum wage in Britain, for example, is going up in April, that's already been wiped out by the rising costs of electricity, the rising costs of gas, and of course the rising costs of on people's food bills. So you've got to deal with some of these problems directly. And of course, the Labour Party, the opposition party, is saying, well, is this the right time to raise taxes? Because national insurance is going up, and that's going to hit almost every family who's in the land. And that's why they are saying that this is perhaps not the right time to deal with the issues of national insurance, when you, of course, you've got to finance the health service, but you've got to make sure that people do not suffer more, because we've had 2 years of a pandemic, and now we've got a cost of living crisis.
Since you left office, you've been using your voice on the global stage to make a difference within education. And of course, as you talk about vaccine equity as well, why is this so important for you personally?
Well, I think we've got a responsibility to the rest of the world. I mean, we've got a responsibility, obviously, in Afghanistan. You can't, as I say, tell people for 20 years you're here to help them, and then just walk away and abandon people who, for no fault of their own, have been landed with a government that they have not had a chance to choose, but has been imposed on them. But when it comes to the rest of the world and what we're doing about vaccinations, I think we're realizing there is self-interest here, because if the vaccine is not administered in Africa, then we will have other new variants, and even Omicron will not be the last one. And so, you know, we're only safe here if we are safe everywhere. And that's why vaccination has got to spread around the world. So there's an enlightened self-interest. But I also think when they asked the British people this week about vaccinating the rest of the world, a poll that was done by the One organization found that 2/3 of people thought it was only fair that the people of other countries should have the chance to get vaccinated in the same way as people in their own countries. And perhaps they said there was a case for health workers, for example, in Africa, getting preference to having a fourth booster jab in Britain. So there is a sense that we're all in this together, and I think that's felt by the public. And it's really up to politics and public decision makers to reflect that in some of the decisions that they're now making. And I think we have lost this habit that I was very much involved in 2009 when we had the global financial crisis, of cooperating to solve our problems, global problems that need global solutions. And nationalism, unfortunately, is probably the dominant ideology of the age, and it's led to protectionism as well as great power competition. So I think we've got to restore this idea that we can work together with other countries to make a difference.
How worried are you about what faces the next generation? Of course, you talked earlier about the UN goal of achieving quality education for all by 2030. Is that achievable?
At the moment, it does not look as if you can achieve it because we are so far behind. That's also true in poverty, where we said we would eliminate absolute poverty, which was quite a modest objective because we're dealing with people living on less than $2 a day. Clearly on health, we've been set back by what's happened on the pandemic. So we will need a huge effort, a resumption of activity in a way that we have not seen before if we're going to get close to these sustainable development goals. And that's why we've got this education summit in September. That's why the Secretary General, and I'm one of his envoys, is pressing us to do more. But I think we need to think very seriously, and this is the big issue for the next few years, about how we fund our global public goods. I mean, it's clearly in our interests to avoid infectious diseases, but you can't do that unless you have a worldwide strategy for doing that, because if disease happens in one country, it will inevitably spread if there's not a common way of dealing with it. And so we need to restore this idea that there are certain public goods, and that's a clean environment, and therefore you need to tackle climate change, the control of infectious diseases, and therefore you need the medicines, the treatments, and the vaccinations. These public goods have got to be funded, and we've got to find a system where countries are prepared to share, burden share. And it's really interesting that we were able to agree in the 1960s a burden sharing agreement between all the countries of the world to deal with smallpox, but we have not been able to agree in 2022 for a burden sharing agreement to deal with COVID. And that shows how setback we have been in international cooperation from where we used to be to where we are now. And I think we've got to make a very spirited effort in the next few years to rebuild the systems of international cooperation that deliver the public goods we're talking about.
Former Prime Minister Gordon Brown, thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you.